Hi all, hope you've been staying safe and well. Today's lesson we're going to have a look at another theme question with an inspector calls, and this time we're going to focus on the topic of gender. So like last time, what we're going to see is a typical exam response, and then we're going to have a quick look at my plan and how I go about planning the different styles in which you can do this, and then we're going to break it apart into its separate components, and then at the end it's going to be over to you to have a look at doing your own version of this plan, and then ultimately looking at writing the essay and the response that you would go for. So I hope this is really useful, and again it's another good example of looking at that second type of question rather than character, where it's a theme or an idea and how that is going to come across in Priestley's play. Okay, so what we have here is a typical question. Now, there is a little bit of a typo on this one where it says the gender, but if we could just ignore that. It says, how does Priestley present gender in An Inspector Calls? Write about the ideas about gender in An Inspector Calls, and how Priestley presents these ideas by the way he writes, which is worth 30 marks, with 4 marks for your spelling, your punctuation and your grammar. Now, what we have here is my plan looking at how I would respond to this particular question. So, like last time, I would start with an introduction with the big picture. What is Priestley trying to achieve, or how is this theme relevant to what Priestley is trying to do? Followed by at least 3, ideally 4, ideas and what we could explore with some evidence, and then finally an overall conclusion about what we learn about this particular theme across the play. So what we're going to do is we're going to break apart this essay plan. We'll have a look at each section in turn with a little bit of discussion with each, and then hopefully that'll be really useful in helping you to plan and prepare your essay and your response. Okay, the first thing we want to set out, which is the top right hand corner of our essay response, if we've got the full thing in front of us, is to look at the big picture, an introduction of what this theme is all about, how it's relevant to what Priestley's trying to achieve, and what sort of messages Priestley's trying to create by exploring this theme across the play. So what I've gone for is the big idea being that Priestley's using this play to teach the audience about the inequalities between genders at the time the play was written and at the time the play was set. So at the top I've got some key vocabulary, which is injustice, prejudice, patriarchal, sexist, vulnerability. Now these are words that I'm going to try and get into my introduction because they'll help to set the scene to the examiner that I understand the core concept, I understand what's going on here. Linking it back to, say, for example, when we looked at the responsibility essay, we talked about an ideology, the ideas that Priestley's trying to present here. I've also tried to include, if possible, some contextual information. So we know that the play is set in 1912, but it was actually written and first performed in 1945. Well, the women's suffrage movement about the rights for votes for women, the rights of equal pay and equal value in society, if you like, was a huge contextual issue at the time. And the big change that took place after the First World War is the 1918 right for women to have the vote. So this is huge contextual links and information that's going on at the time that we can hopefully draw in to show a wider contextual understanding at the time that the play is being written and performed. Okay, my first big idea that I'd like to consider is the idea that female characters in the play are somewhat dismissed as shallow and insignificant. If we think about particularly Sheila, the majority of the opening section of the play is about Sheila being obsessed with clothes and jewellery and the materialistic ideas that she possesses. So some quotations and some evidence that I thought would be useful to look at. Things like, what about this ring, Sheila, showing how Gerald thinks he can possess her, he can use the engagement ring to win Sheila over. The fact that at the start of the play she says, is it the one that you wanted me to have, showing that she's actually been controlled by Gerald, and it's she describes the ring as beautiful and how wonderful it is. When she first hears about a young girl who's died, she asks, was she young, pretty, showing her obsession with looks and the material world rather than to do with personality and empathetic. We also have the fact that her opinions and ideas are dismissed. She's frequently told to be quiet. Mr. Berlin, when he is dealing with the inspector, tells Sheila that he's going to go and discuss it quietly in the corner with the inspector. She doesn't have to worry herself. So the fact that women are being dismissed in this way is very significant, and Priestley suggesting that at the time the play is being performed and written, women were treated as inferior, and they were seen as people who would be obsessed with that material world rather than having valid emotions, feelings and attitudes that would be considered by the wider community. Okay, my second point I'd like to consider is the idea that male characters are using their gender to assume control over women. So what we have is three male characters in particular. We have Mr. Berlin in his ownership of Eva Smith in the factory. We have Gerald and Eric with their romantic and sexual behaviour towards Eva Smith in the town. Now, some evidence that I've come up with here, we have Eric's confession that when he met Eva Smith, he was in that sort of state when a chap easily turns nasty. When I've talked about euphemisms before, about how characters try to play down what they have done, and this is a good example of that, where Eric's saying that it was where he could easily turn nasty. We could easily use much more violent, aggressive language there to substitute for the word nasty, but he's treating her like a possession. He's treating her as if he's using that control and that dominance over her. Gerald, when he's confronted about the fact that he used Eva Smith for his own desires, or Daisy Renton as he knows her, he says, well, it was inevitable, I suppose, the fact that he would assume that role of controlling her. And Sheila even uses this phrase, her wonderful fairy prince, the fact that he's using his status and his power and his gender in particular to control that. So we see male characters behaving in quite a despicable manner towards women, and it's the fact that they can do this is Priestley's point. The fact that they assume that they can use their gender to control women is a negative aspect of how gender is being presented in the play. Okay, the third point I'd like to consider is looking at the way that women interact with women in the play. Now, what we might assume is that women would be more sympathetic and more empathetic towards other women, and in fact that's not quite the case. When we have Mrs. Burling and Sheila interacting with Eva throughout the play, we have this women challenging each other and making petty judgments and jealousy about other women. So some of it is to do with, like I said, jealousy. For example, Sheila, where she says that she felt that Eva was being impertinent and laughing at her. She felt that she was in a furious temper because of the way that Eva is behaving. And that's partly to do with petty jealousy, because Eva, she even says that she was a good-looking girl, she would be able to take care of herself. However, there are also other deeper rooted prejudices about different women. Mrs. Burling sees herself as superior, and she talks about girls of that sort, girls of that class. And as she dismisses Eva's ridiculous airs and scruples, ridiculous morals, just because Eva's from a lower class and is in a particular situation, means that Mrs. Burling dismisses her completely and has no sort of time for her to listen to what she has to say, and in that sense misses the important aspect of who this person really is. So we do have women judging other women and behaving in quite a harsh manner that we might not expect when we consider the way that women as a whole are being controlled in this society at the time. Okay, so my final key point that I want to consider is looking at the idea of women being treated almost like a commodity and almost like property. Now we have in particular, for example, Sheila, when she learns about the way that Mr. Burling treats his workers and doesn't want to pay them any extra, she describes them as these girls aren't cheap labour, they're people. So the fact that the women are viewed as cheap labour is significant, and it's important to understand that's quite a key quotation. We have the way that the male characters treat women as almost like property, almost like livestock, is quite an interesting way of looking at it. So the inspector tells Eric that he treated Eva Smith like an animal, and Gerald describes her as young and fresh, almost like a piece of fruit or a piece of meat rather than a human being. The fact that the inspector tells Gerald that you installed her as your mistress, like a business transaction, if you like, rather than a romantic relationship. So there are lots of examples throughout the play where women are being treated like possessions, like items, like goods and services, rather than human beings. And Priestley's message is saying how wrong and how despicable this behaviour actually is. Okay, so finally, to wrap up with a conclusion, what I've gone for is that Priestley's encouraging the audience to reflect on their own gender prejudices and reflecting on those attitudes in society at the time. Are there changes that we could make to make the society more equal? And the big part we have in this is the inspector's final speech, where he talks about how we do not live alone. We need to take into account other people's positions and values. And probably the main phrase that I'll be looking at using in my conclusion is the fact that there are millions and millions and millions of Eva Smiths and John Smiths still with us. So we can talk about how gender is a particularly important aspect of control, and how, because Eva Smith is a woman in the play, is installing lots of prejudices and lots of societal pressures around her that make it more significant and make her situation even more difficult than it would have been if she was male. So a conclusion, just to wrap it up neatly and look at how we can explore how Priestley is using the play to explore gender prejudices and the horrors of a patriarchal society for women. Okay, for you to do the same as last time, what I've put at in the next couple of slides is the essay question, which is looking at how gender is represented across Inspector Calls, and then my completed essay plan, which we've broken apart into its component parts here. What I'd like you to do for me is to have a look at either producing your own essay plan or a full essay style response based around this gender question, and if you could pass it on to me and have a look at it, that would be great. Have a look through it. Obviously, if you want to pause the video, take a screen grab of the essay plan, it is also available via Google Classroom as well. Please do so. Stay tuned at the end. We've got today's film recommendation, but I hope that's been really useful. Okay, for today's film recommendation, I've gone from a classic from 1994, a film that's been parodied so many times in so many different ways, but is actually a really heartfelt story and a fantastic coming-of-age drama with lots of interesting cameos, shall we say, and that's Forrest Gump. It's a really, really fantastic film when you watch it back. In particular, the scenes in Vietnam are really powerful and heartrending. It's a fantastic film. If you've never seen it, I highly, highly recommend checking it out. Until next time, make sure you stay safe, and we're going to be looking at another theme question in our next video.